Но то, что вот этот Алеша известно Болгарии всей.
Well, one thing that I wanted to start with is I was telling Joe before you joined, and just like what maybe like works of art have you guys engaged in over the last maybe couple of weeks? Any observations? Anything that's maybe relevant for this conversation?
Not me. Yesterday I watched On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the James Bond movie with George Lazenby. So I'd never seen it fully before. But
Not. I'm guessing it's not high art.
no, but it's actually a lot better movie than James Bond's fans slag it as. It's just because it was the first one without Sean Connery. But
okay,
Yeah.
I recently saw. Well, in the last couple of weeks, I saw that movie Tape, Richard Linklater. So I saw it first time maybe like 10, 15 years ago. When I was rewatching it now, I just get the sense that, whenever we talk about the arts, one idea that just keeps coming back to me is, great art or like good art or anything that's worthwhile. It's just very much additive, right? Like in a purely kind of, almost mathematical sense. Like, I'm not sure if any of you saw this, but the film is basically two guys, they meet up like 10 years after graduating high school. They haven't seen each other in a while. And they start essentially confronting each other about various things. And, it so easily could turn into like, let's turn this into a movie about a guy confronting another guy about a rape, 10 years ago. And, the kind of like, moral strength of that. But what it does is like everybody that has a complaint in the film, right? Everybody that has some kind of accusation to make, as characters get introduced and new situations are introduced, you see that, all these complaints are as easily applicable to anyone else, right? So you keep getting layer upon layer upon layer, maybe like every 15 or so minutes, you get this kind of structural shift, right? So, I think an easy way of viewing, great art versus mediocre art versus like anything in between is, how much are you really adding, right? Like, what are the layers really doing? Because there is something tangibly going on there in an additive sense, right? That lesser art simply is not going to have.
Yeah, and I'm not familiar with this film that you just mentioned. So this is freshly out, and in the past couple of weeks, basically.
Oh no, this is an old film from like 2002, I believe.
Oh, this is old. Okay,
yeah,
I just haven't seen it.
Yeah. But that was my observation. Just a sense that whenever you look at something that's worthwhile, you're just adding more, right? Like it's always like there's more of something, right? The universe in some way changes by this addition. It's not an addition that eventually just gets subsumed by something else and disappears. And it's not an addition in the sense of like, war might be like, well, war's an addition of something, but there's also so much more subtraction involved, right? And the things that you're subtracting by way of good art, these are subtractions that the world sort of doesn't need to begin with, right? So anyway, that was just my observation there. If anyone else has anything else to say, if not, we could like get into the book.
I did see a Mike Leigh film, Naked, which it was his first major, or maybe the second major film. Jessica had seen it. It reminded me of Martin Scorsese's After Hours. It was a good film. I wouldn't say it was a great film, but it was good.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, I actually recently went to see Tenet, the latest Christopher Nolan film, and then shortly thereafter rewatched Memento. And it's pretty striking how much better Memento is than Tenet in terms of dealing with themes of time and memory. And, Nolan has such big budgets anymore for his films. Tenet is probably one of the most stunning films I've ever seen in terms of tricks and cinematic techniques that money can buy. But in terms of the story and what actually takes place, Memento is so much better. Plus Guy Pearce's performance in that is leaps and bounds better, I think, than anyone was in Tenet. So, and also recently did another side-by-side of rewatching The Tree of Life from Malick and Thin Red Line from Malick. And again, just a juxtaposition of, the way that the narrative moves better in Thin Red Line, Tree of Life. It's like so visually stunning, but that whole fugue sequence, that's, just the rip off of 2001 in a lot of ways and goes on forever. And it's beautiful, but you're ready for it to be done because you get the point about a minute in and it goes on for whatever, like 15 minutes. And there's just other things that he misses there that were better in Thin Red Line by a stretch, even though the two stories, ostensibly war is framing both of them a little bit, but it's been interesting to do those side by sides. So
yeah, it's interesting how now, let's say if you have these like big budgets, like the fact that you're given so many tools to work with, you had this ironic thing happening where very little of it is actually used, right? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, so you essentially get a big budget, but the ends just aren't there. Right. And I'm not sure if this is a case of like artists freezing up or, getting too old. It could be anything, but I get the sense that the more tools that you have, like this is true in the arts. This is also true generally in life. There is such a thing as like as an excess, right, of tools in that way.
Well, that's Scorsese. Scorsese is the king of that. A few months ago, I borrowed my mother-in-law's Netflix to watch The Irishman, and it's a totally pointless movie. It's 3.5 hours long. The effects used to supposedly de-age De Niro and Pacino were ridiculously bad. I mean, and he hasn't done anything of any value since the 20th century, really. Well, I wouldn't say not of any value, but of any great value. And it's like, if I were a pal of Scorsese, I'd say, what you need to do is say, I'm going to go real cheap. Go back to and say, I'm not going to do any movie for 3 or 4 or 5 movies, the next ones I do. I'm going to only have $5 million, which is a lot of money to us folks. But to him, for a movie, say, limit yourself, make raw films. Get back there, because you can't have an 80-year-old man or 78, whatever the hell he is, and you're just going to indulge yourself. It's like watching the last few films of Fellini or Bergman. Scorsese is just wastes so much money on this bullshit, and the story itself is just ridiculously bad. And Woody Allen, at least his films are still small, but they're pretty much pointless too. So.
Have you guys seen any Woody Allen over the last few years? I haven't really, with the exception of like a couple years ago, I saw Wonder Wheel, which had some decent parts to it. It's probably actually one of the better kind of like really late films. But have you guys like kept up with Woody Allen at all, or?
No, I mean, the last one I saw was the Kate Blanchett one where she won an Oscar. What was that?
Blue Jasmine.
Yeah, 2013. Yeah. Well, I have nothing else with that. You guys want to get into Dan's book, The Custodian's Bitch?
Let's do it.
Right.
I mean, if you guys have nothing in way of introduction, I just want viewers to get a sense of the style of the book. Anything like longer and expository, like it's worth it to go over it to some degree, so that people know what they're getting into, and to kind of like frame the rest of the conversation. So, just very briefly, The Custodian's Bitch is about a man who's working in a custodial job at a school. He has lots of observations about the teachers, about the custodians that he works with. He himself is a great writer. It's roughly based on Dan Schneider's actual experiences working for a school. And throughout, I mean, like this phrase, the custodian's bitch, it gets played with in various ways. You have, for example, the fact that all these custodians there, right? Everybody on the job, they're always bitching about something. And the reason why the word bitch is appropriate is, these are complaints that really go nowhere, right? It's usually complaining into a void. And it would be one thing if like these complaints were married to some sort of like action or some kind of like, observations. But most of the people in the book, they don't really offer too much personal insight, right? Except for the narrator, Bence, who just kind of, play off of and make observations of his own. So this is the way that the book starts with the prologue. I cannot recall a single day in my life when pain was not a component, palpable in mind, acting as a guide of sorts through the commons of each day, a teacher of things under the lip of recognition, and even consciousness, almost as if a lover and companion, if not an executor or executioner. It has been omnipresent. Of course, when I speak of pain, I did not mean merely the existential spiritual bullshit sort, like Feldman does, my neighbor who's always complaining of this or that. No, I mean the real pain that comes from days and weeks and months and years and decades of hard physical labor, where the body breaks down in small bits, a broken bone here, a hernia there, a wince to the side, knee to stretch to the middle. It has always angered me that, especially in the industrialized and developed world, so little homage is given to those of us who lift that box and heave that bale. Far fewer people can do hard physical labor than push papers across a desk and bang away at a desktop computer's keyboard. In fact, I recall a teacher I once worked with telling me that he admired the work that I did, physical labor as a custodian, because he knew that he could not do it, even physically. Yet whenever one hears of underpaid professions, teachers are almost always at the top of that list. The working class, the working poor are almost always ignored. Yet teachers are as disposable as any physical laborer. I know, I have seen it. This, in fact, puts me in mind to put you and others straight about certain things. The biases against the working class that so many people who might peruse these musings may hold.
Let me just, one thing. The title of the book is a play on the early 20th, 21st century idea of having, especially feminist books begin, or something like The Astronaut's Wife was a big book, The So-and-so Something. So I thought, to do this, as the custodian's bitch, people would think we're talking about maybe a novel and some custodian has a mistress or something. Yeah. But the bitch is used in the verb sense. So that was one of the reasons I chose that title, to give it the sense of that, like The Astronaut's Wife, and sort of be a lampoon of it.
Yeah, and also like sometimes the possessive gets thrown out. Like, for example, you could just have the custodians plural bitch, right? So that phrase, like you do constantly play with the phrase, and I think for titles like this, it's very useful that text doesn't just stick with like one appearance of the title, right? Like it's and also the fact that it's very episodic in nature. It allows you to just play off various things in various ways, right? That's pretty important.
Yeah. So I will say, when you first proposed doing this book and this show, and then Dan sent me the book, I thought that it would be about a person. The custodian's bitch as a person. So Dan, you were successful with what you just said there in terms of what my immediate guess was as to what the book would be about. But then, you learn pretty quickly it's going to be about the verb sense. So right away, reading that the first few paragraphs that you did, Alex, of the prologue, one thing that stood out to me is, and this is obviously Dan working as a great writer and doing what great writers do, but it's poetic. I mean, there's a few great lines, or at least like lines that draw you in right off the bat, and you're thinking, if this is a custodian who's talking to me, what custodian do I know that would write like this, or that would talk like this? And so, phrases like palpable in mine, or executor and executioner, and these little bits that you get from the get-go are drawing you in and making you think, like, so who exactly is this person that's going to be speaking to me? This is kind of odd, because you expect some kind of like, a little bit more rough around the edges type person to be the narrator. So that was my main thing from the prologue, and obviously like a couple direct philosophical posits that are made that echo and reverberate through the rest of the novel.
Yeah, very quickly afterwards, I didn't get a chance because it would go on too long. But these observations turn into, Ben, the narrator, is walking through, and he notices that he might have accidentally killed a cricket, right? Which becomes its own kind of like set of philosophical observations, which is also like a very like Dan thing, right? There's often in Dan's books, dead or dying animals, the kinds of observations that you would have about that. And also, like, I'm not sure how, Dan feels about this person. I think it might have been mentioned in the book, but, I've always liked the idea of writing about things that otherwise would just be completely, passed over.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And in some of my notes, maybe we'll get to as we continue to talk about the novel and moving through it, like, there are quite a bit of these moments where, Ben's character is noticing or identifying with different kinds of animals. So you highlighted the cricket. We've got the bull toad, which reappears multiple times. We've got like one of my pull quotes that I may read later. He notices coyotes howling in the distance and wonders what's going on with them. So there's a lot of this, extrapolation and moving beyond human relationships, which in this case aren't giving him much of anything anyway, and deciding to engage with the rest of the cosmos. And they frame up a lot of nice moments in the book.
Yeah. I have some things to say about the bull toad. I'm not sure, like, Dan, do you want to jump in to mention anything yet, or should we just like keep going through?
The only thing I would say is this was a very easy book to write. I wrote it about 6 months after I started it, actually 6 months after I left that job. And I had a whole pile, probably about 200 Post-its that, when I get home, I'd write down, this custodian said this, or this happened. And basically it was just putting them into a month by month category. I mean, the book literally basically wrote itself. I mean, I have the observations, but if there's 2 or 3 actual little paragraphs that are made up stuff, that's probably a lot, because it's basically exactly what happened.
I have it like on my phone, for example, as a text document, and I have like, they have like all these like reading apps, and like if I'm walking or whatever, like I could just load up articles and just walk and just have them read to me, so I don't have to worry about reading something later.
I'm so 20th century.
That's what? I'm
so 20th century.
Yeah, well, like honestly, like I can't, I wouldn't be able to, like I would not normally read like a Dan book like this. I wouldn't be able to like read many of the plays that way, but something I've read before, it's a bit easier. But like when somebody's reading it to you and they're giving you like the pauses that you yourself might not ordinarily do, like you do get like a more kind of slanted like version of the text that you've envisioned some other way. And like I remember like actually walking, like laughing out loud at things that I didn't notice before. Like I don't remember if it's like Fat Rat or Dead Puss, where like she comes up to the Ben character and she's like, what does the I in CISD stand for? And you were like independent, and he was, and she asked what it was, and you were like, do you mean the concept or the word, or like something like that? And like the fact that somebody would have like such a such a question, but it's also very real because like you meet people like this, right? And it's something that you otherwise might sort of, because the book is kind of very prosaic in the sense that, this is a guy working as a janitor. We're going to have like a lot of attachment to like just basic, just like you have the basic grunt work, a lot of the writing is like very grunt-like in the writing, right? So you don't, you get lots of poetic moments, but a lot of it is sort of implicit, and the humor, might function in a similar way sometimes.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And one of my comments as well about the episodic nature of the writing is that it ingrains some of the feelings that Ben is talking about to you as the reader. And I know that probably by 30 pages in, there would be times where I'd be reading and like need to walk away because I was almost exhausted even just thinking about like the waves of days that were breaking on Ben, and how rote the whole thing is and how futile it seems. And so I think that was a smart choice, because it just it wears on you as the reader. And it, even though there are these moments of humor and things that pick you up, there's also a lot of dragging you down and feeling, feeling this world that you've entered into. So that, I think it served a good purpose from that standpoint.
And, there's as an author, you would have various strategies to tackle something like that. So like if you say like, hey, I'm going to, do this book that features this grunt work, am I going to just like poeticize and have these like long sort of, if you imagine like John Cassavetes, like you could maybe see like a long sort of shot of somebody just working and working and working. You don't really have that much there. You have just enough to show what the work is, what it entails. And just, the observations that kind of tee off of that. Like another quote that I remember when I first read it, then I read it again and I showed it to my wife when I was reading it next to her. Cause it's just so memorable, right? Like just imagine. So this is like one of the episodes, like the book, it's structured where you have, every time you have a new like section within a chapter, you get like 5 asterisks, and sometimes they're incredibly short. So this is just like one of the sections. A few days ago, a pallet fell on my foot and blackened one of my toenails. In a few days, it will fall off and take a good month or more to get a full nail back. This has happened before, right? Like you need nothing else in terms of showing like, he's talking about like all the kind of, physical decrepitude that comes with physical labor. But here, you like the fact that the narrator has immediately a sense of, oh, this is what it is. This has happened to me several times before. It might happen again. I know what the process is. Most people, by definition, that would read this book, especially now, like, maybe in the future we'll have less and less physical labor around. They probably will never be in a situation where they get the experience of having a nail fall off and growing back, right? This is something that's very foreign and exotic to most people. But in just, a couple of sentences, you get, so much of what was being discussed kind of like a little bit in the abstract. This is a very kind of like, you see this in sharp relief here.
Let me just say something about number one. When you said that, I remembered when I lifted it up, the top board actually broke off because it wasn't nailed in properly. But this is about form meeting function. The style that I use here, I've used in a few other books, not as pithily here, and I call it the bridge style, which is Evan S. Connell did Mr. and Mrs. Bridge. And he uses those forms too. And those are by far his 2 best books, Mr. and Mrs. Bridge, where you'd get anywhere from maybe just a couple of sentences to sometimes a page and a half of these little episodes. When I did True Life, which is a 4-volume memoir, I had written about 860,000 words in the 4 books, and I edited it down to 680,000 by removing excess words and punctuation and so forth. And I got that very rat-a-tat-tat Hemingway style. When I did, for example, A Norwegian in the Family, there you have these long, passages where you could have 15, 20 pages of someone just looking at sneakers that are tied up around wires and whatnot. That's my total immersion kind of thing. And I sort of go like an accordion. Depending on the book, I change formats when I'm doing plays. It all depends on what the format is. And here, when you're dealing with just basically what most people would not find any interest in, you don't want to overwhelm them. But humor is also a very good lubricant to get people into a work.
Dan, one quick question for you too, just in terms of any influences that might have been in mind when you were writing this. Were you thinking of Vonnegut at all?
No, the Bridge books, the form. It was the form and what I experienced. I basically, if you could imagine me like playing a saxophone, it's me blowing through the bridge. My experience is going through the saxophone that is the bridge form.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, so I can see that in terms of the format. I will say, just from my reading of it, I was feeling a little bit of Vonnegut influence just in terms of like this like mid-America, work-a-day, and even the names of some of the characters are like just so American and kind of harsh and almost nasty. It's like Deb Puss or Zeke. When you compare that to something like a Kilgore Trout, from Vonnegut's novels. It had some of that same, and some of the bleak, just offhand moments of humor that happen with almost describing things so exactly as they are that when you're the reader, then you think about this and you're like, fuck yeah, like that is funny. I mean, that I've never thought about that once before in my life, but either I've had that experience or I know someone who has, and it is humorous. So I had a little bit of shades of Vonnegut at times.
I always think it's good to move to use humor, especially when you're doing something political, because without a doubt, this is probably, well, all my books have some element of politics. I mean, certainly a Norwegian in the Family has some political elements. So did the Vincetti brothers. But this is, I wrote this not only just because I experienced it rather recently when I wrote it, but I wanted to talk. There's very little. If you look in American culture, working class people are shown to be either boobs or idiots, the Roseanne or the married with children kind of thing, people to be made fun of, or they're shown as sort of pathetic losers. That if it wasn't some kind of independent film, someone's got a drug problem or this or that, and it's all bleak. But or
heroes, right? On the other side, there's sometimes if you have like a typical communist writer, they might turn, like Deb Puss into some kind of hero, right? Which is that's also a pitfall, right? And it happens, it happens in stories in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I just deal with these people and the character of Ben Christian, which is the doppelganger for me, as it happened, as much as I can possibly do.
Yeah. One thing that I was wondering about, since since we already got on the topic of like episodic writing, so the structure in this book is we start with a prologue, then we have, I forget how many chapters, but every month or so, I think there's
every month,
like there's like a date, and that's like a de facto chapter. Then within each chapter, you have these like smaller episodes, and just structurally speaking, like for anybody out there that might want to start doing some kind of writing, oftentimes like it's easier to be episodic. Like I remember with my very first novel, like I thought, let me just do these kinds of episodes because it's easier when you're starting out. But I also, like we've seen tons of like pitfalls, right? Like with episodic film, for example, you could have a situation where suddenly you have episode after episode after episode. Things don't really seem to cohere. Things don't really come together. It's just, it just becomes kind of like showing off, right? Like, oh, look at my episodes, and people could sort of use that as a buzzword if they discuss my film or whatever. So, like, do you have any suggestions for people that might be interested in doing like an episodic book like this? Like what are the ways to avoid some of the worst like kind of like associations that we might make with episodic writing?
Let it come naturally. There was a woman that I won't say I was involved with, but I tried to be involved with many years ago. I saw her do a video or something. Was it on some website or whatnot. She had posted something on Instagram or something, and I had stumbled over it. We're just Googling around. Every so often I'll Google people, find out who died, who's alive or whatnot. And I came upon her thing, and she's one of these people that has these post-its all over her board, a whole timeline sketched out. You have to be organic in however you create an art form. Less than 1% of the time, maybe you need a highly structured Kubrickian Hitchcock way of approaching things. But especially when you're doing something episodic, just let things bubble up. Like, I mean, if you're cooking something, let things bubble up as they come. Don't try to impose a narrative. This doesn't have to be a feminist take on the power structure of Texas school districts or something. Let it just come as it's going to come, and surprise yourself. People too often when they create art, and I've said this many times, so I repeat myself, enjoy the art. When I read or experience most things that pass or are presented as art, the thing I find is a typical kind of joylessness about it, and you just have to let it come as it comes.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add, a typical response to that would be like, well, how do you know, whether something comes organically is good or not? Well, you won't ever truly know in that sense, but the best way to get there, right, to put yourself in a position where maybe you do know is, in the case of books, you would obviously have to just read as much as possible. You would have to see how other people approach this and just choose, the things that are kind of most stark, most effective. And, your definitions don't have to be the same as someone else's definition, but, you essentially have like an entire body of work to deal with, right? An entire, millennia of work. So, that's probably the best way in that sense. This is, this is a stand-in. Ben is a stand-in for you. But, when I'm reading the book, I obviously get so much of the Dan that I already know in my personal life, but there's also things in a book that are things that you probably wouldn't do or say in your real life. So how would you go about like doing a book like this while making sure that, hey, whatever character that I put in, they can't be just, perfect in some way, right? They can't merely represent the idealization of what I believe in the world, what I want to see in the world, what I want other people to be like, what I want my own example to serve for others. Like how did you approach like imperfections in characters in this book?
Well, as far as the Ben Christian character, any character that's a doppelganger of mine is somehow different. Manny Cole, who narrates the New York Quartet, is a more a poor, what's the guy, Rupert Murdoch wannabe kind of reporter version of me with less scruples. The book I just recently finished and sent out to you guys levels the main character there, whose name is Tom, has more of a, I guess, white knight kind of effect. He ends up trying to save the world. But as far as the imperfections, if it works, it works. Whether it's with the Ben character, whether it's with the teachers, or whether it's with the management or the other custodians. Like I said, these things happened, and it's just easy. It was one of the easiest works I've ever done. It's like 88,000 words, but I mean, if it's just basically just structuring and putting them together, and I remember them. So I have, my memory oftentimes is like an old zip file, is that I can write a word down. Let's say if I said Deb Puss caterpillar, I'll know what I'm talking about. Is it some incident where Deb Puss might have stepped on a caterpillar or something, mm-hmm. and I'll remember what I thought at the time and whatnot, and it all comes back to me, and I just write it down.
Yeah. One thing about that is like it's just an interesting kind of like disconnect in the sense that, so like as someone is reading the book, they get the sense that, okay, so this narrator sounds bitter, and given the kind of like laser-like focus on just objective, highly realistic judgments about himself, about life, about the position that he's in, doesn't I wouldn't say that makes a character sound unlikable, but it makes the character someone that most people, for whatever reason, don't necessarily want to know. However, as characters later on come up in the book and they make observations about the narrator, they say things like, I see custodians working here all the time, but you're the only one that's not bitter, or you're someone that I could actually talk to, right? Or, you have at the end, these teachers give the narrator like various gift cards or whatever when he's leaving the job. So, and I actually noticed that is a similar disconnect between the kind of feelings that people might associate with you, Dan, like when they were just reading your essays, versus if they were to, like, I don't know, Skype with you or, physically meet you. Because I think people, definitely get the sense, like in these videos, that you're someone that laughs a lot. Like you take lots of pleasure, in all sorts of like little things in the world and in your surroundings. And those themselves are qualities that are very likable and that, draw people to people, right? That's just an example of charisma, but that doesn't necessarily come out in the book until you get, the characters that come up as like, the objective stand is like they're able to offer a point of view that by definition the narrator can't offer. And it has a nice parallel, I think, to your actual like real life, because I've said this before, but I remember I was pretty surprised by the difference between how you seemed when we first spoke versus how it was just purely over email or text.
Well, one of the reasons I do these interviews on my different plays and whatnot with Peter Cleese was also to show that I'm just a regular person in the one sense, because Jessica always gets upset. She'll see some thread somewhere where these people are saying, "Whoa, what an asshole!" Or like the old Ebert the thread or whatnot. And I was just looking at the Ebert thread; it's over 8,000 now, and there was some people that in the early part would write things like, "You need to have a heart with your brain. What does this guy think?" It's like, these people just projecting their own things onto things that I've written or said simply because I say Tom Cruise is a bad actor or Spielberg is a bad filmmaker, and they take it personally. But in regards to the book, I mean, the character of Ben is a bit embittered. He talks about having lost a job he had for almost a decade, and then a temp job in between where he was screwed over. And then, but compared to the other people there, he's very well adjusted, at least the other custodians and even some of the teachers. And that's, there's a realism there that a lot of people don't talk about. And the people will just often, I mean, there's a number of times when someone like Deb Puss character, who is this 60-year-old short little woman from Texas, who'd be, "You look too happy. Don't be happy." And I say she walked away scratching her ass. Literally, she'd come up and say, "Don't be happy," or something like that.
Yeah. I know that you, Joe, you had some notes where you were talking about like the likability of the character, and how that might play into like, this idea of we don't want perfect characters. Like what flaws can we write in that are natural and make sense and cohere with the rest of the text?
Yeah, so I can comment on that. And I also wrote in my notes about the unique nature of being taken through an environment like this by a character who has other redeeming arcs to their life. So in this case, Dan is a doppelganger for you, but he's a great artist on the side, and clearly at different points tells us very directly that he's bitter about his inability to make a living doing that, where he could spend even more time on it, improve at it more, push the art form forward, and so on. And like on the one hand, sometimes it at the beginning especially comes off as like a little bit preachy or makes the character a little bit less likable. But when you realize that he's also just, in a lot of ways, the only character who's really getting on with it and still working this job, still thinking about the potential to move on to something else that could be better, is important. And so, he's existing in both worlds and like has kind of accepted that this is going to be what has to happen in terms of like where you're at right now, just economically, and what must happen to stay alive, basically, right, and sustain oneself. But that's another key point, is that there's also, by telling the story this way and having the narrator and main character with these attributes, it's really unique because we don't have just another omniscient narrator telling us about as Alex said earlier, like some heroic working class citizen's life and attempt to like save the school district. None of that happens. He doesn't get suicidal. He doesn't get totally depressed and down and just, one day want to off himself or someone else. He also doesn't have a magnificent triumph at any point, right? It's just things go on. Things keep happening to him. He responds, takes it in, forms, and makes something, good or great out of it with the artwork that results. But there's no like big, huge moment for Ben where all of a sudden like he's won simply by being good. And that's one of your main philosophical posits in the book too. So the likability that I commented on in my notes also is just tied a bit to like, Ben will just say what's on his mind or tell us what's on his mind. So he's married, but he still has these attractions to various women. He feels or knows that he could improve a lot of things that higher ups are in charge of right now, and kind of tells us how it should be. If I were king for a day sort of thing, which people I think find like inherently off-putting a lot of the time, even though we all think those thoughts to ourselves, right? I mean, if we're being honest about that. So maybe not inherently likable, but certainly relatable.
And also like I said earlier about that, like even if we discuss this like question likability, there's just always a difference between even as a reader, like you have to think there's a difference between how this narrator will present himself, like whether to other characters or in the text itself, versus like what actually goes on, in the moments that don't make it into the art, right? There's plenty of moments that led up to, Ben getting, all the gifts at the end of the year from the teachers after he's leaving, and nobody else did, right? We see some of those moments, but we don't see all of them, right? So there's you should always expect, like, even just without even making like personal assumptions about, a writer's life, like, you would think that, as you're reading a book, right, the narrator's self-presentation, there's always that chance that how that is in the book versus how the characters truly, let's say if you were ripped out of the book and you put all the moments that don't make it into the book, like that's going to be different, right? And that just opens up new avenues for playing with those kinds of realities, right? That, I get the feeling that most people don't really think about that.
I mentioned this Mike Leigh movie called Naked, and it was his first big hit. It won the Cannes, I think, Golden Lion or Palme d'Or maybe. And in it, there's the main character played by David Thewlis, an actor called Johnny. And Johnny is the typical kind of working class person that you would see in the kind of stuff you mentioned in a negative tone earlier. Johnny is a stylist. He's able to quote from the Bible and other works of art here and there, but he's bullshitting. He doesn't know really anything about it. He's a drunk. He's a drifter. He's a grifter. He goes from Manchester down to London to sponge off an ex-girlfriend. Then he fucks the ex-girlfriend's roommate. Then he has a series of adventures where he's belittling people, fucking around with people. He ends up getting beaten up. He has a moment where he's lying on the floor of the ex-girlfriend's apartment, and he's just and he's going crazy. And then he ends up stealing money, and the film ends with him hobbling away from the house. And that's the kind of thing that I didn't want to do, because there are people that when I looked on YouTube I watched some videos about the movie afterwards. They think Johnny is a hero and he's a victim of society and whatnot. And that's such bullshit, because I've known, the character of Ben, as I write him, is not like that. He's a hardworking guy who does stuff. He's actually a great artist, unlike this Johnny, who could have been maybe, if he hadn't been such a dick. And that's a much more appealing. You don't have to have, first off, a character that is likable. It has to be relatable. And Johnny isn't relatable. And that's one of the flaws. Like, Jessica was much higher on the movie than I was. I think it's a good to arguably very good movie, but it's nowhere near a great movie. It's nowhere near, say, even Mean Streets, where the De Niro character is an asshole, but a more specific type of asshole. Whereas this Johnny is well acted, but is a sort of generic asshole. And we've seen this type before. You're not going to like him. You can't really relate to him, and because most assholes aren't going to see a movie like this. But Ben, on the other hand, is someone who, if you've ever worked a blue collar job on a loading dock or at a warehouse or in a supermarket or custodial kind of thing. That's you're going to meet these kinds of characters, and every so often you will find someone in one of these blue collar jobs that's a bit above. But the fact of the matter is, most of the teachers, I'll give you, I think at the end of the book, I talk about how I gave some of my plays to some of the teachers. I never expected to hear from them. They never came back. And these are all English language teachers that some of them said, "Oh yes, Dan, I'd like to read it." But I knew I'd never hear from them again, because there's not any real interest in even these people who teach English. And I think I mentioned how some of the ridiculous ways of how book reports, kids nowadays write a paragraph, draw a picture, and so, I mean, anyway, it's just so dumbed down.
Yeah.
About these kind of characters in general. One thing I sort of mentioned this in the beginning is, so, if you're doing this kind of book about blue collar work, like, it's very tempting to do something like, hey, I'm going to present these blue collar janitors as like heroes, and the villains will be the teachers. The villains will be the administration. And I mean, there's definitely some villainy in terms of like, well, not the administration. I mean, they don't set like the pay, right? But definitely this is like, obviously this is a corrupt school district in a kind of more generally kind of corrupt system, right? There's low pay. They do things like try to take away holidays. They try to nickel and dime everybody in terms of like just getting them to pay for things that should already be provided for as like a common good, especially if you're employed here for this like wider specific purpose, like that should be taken care of. But every once in a while, like you can't also just like make fun of them, right? Like there are occasional moments of insight. I think it's maybe it was Zeke or somebody else that said this, and this line comes up and again, how the more educated someone is, the further they get away from common sense, right? The less common sense they have. And maybe like we could like speak about like that quote or that idea. The higher up you go in education, the less common sense you have. Like how does that play out in the real world? How does that play out in the book? Because I'm sure we all have observations about this. Like we've all seen this play out, right?
That's why CEOs support Biden and Trump rather than the Green Party or other things, just to get it back to the political motive here. Is that they, But anyway, let Joe take that.
Well, yeah, I think we see that. And to a certain extent in the book, too, it's important to note that similar to what goes on with the sketching and drawing out of the custodial characters, there are some teachers and some other members of the administration with some redemptive qualities. So once again, it is not an all or nothing. And that's important to remember. But, definitely we do see... this idea that it's kind of shocking how equally disengaged those sorts of people can be from real rubrics for understanding and evaluating art, real passion to know it and to teach it and to help another generation of people, would-be artists maybe, but at bare minimum, just humans understand it and take in and create a more intensive filter for what they're going to demand to see and to experience from art throughout their lifetime, and perpetuate that, on and keep advancing it. And as you said earlier, Alex, make it additive on the overall arc of art to the next cycle. So, I don't know that I can talk about like a ton of personal, very direct experience I've had in my life, but you definitely do see this. And we've all probably like either said it to each other or known of this in little bits and pieces. But when you see like huge awards for things that go to stuff that you can just watch or read at one time and be like, who are the people evaluating this stuff? I mean, it's just there's nothing great here. There's nothing memorable. That I was even I think after Jessica, Dan not too long ago mentioned to me Louise Glick, who just won the Nobel for Literature, with her poetry, and that just kind of put me on a real quick like wormhole of Nobel winners from the past in literature. 1 out of every 10. You know this name still, right?
Bob Dylan, the literary genius.
Yeah.
Right.
Because they couldn't find anybody else. That's the thing. Like, it's like they're not even pretending anymore. Literature is just so fucked up that they're like, all right, this year we're gonna give it to Bob Dylan, right? Which is sad.
One point. One of the things with the character of Ben, he does change. It isn't just a static kind of thing, because we know before the book starts, we hear Ben have talked about having lost a prior job because he was standing up for something at the supermarket he worked. And there's one incident where there's a young girl named Lauren who's being verbally abused by one of the teachers. As Ben is cleaning up, he's seeing her in the hallway being shouted out. And he later tells another teacher about it, who offers that, well, you can go report it to the, and Ben says, no, I'm not. And basically the girl ends up okay. She's one of these SPED students, special education students, and this is now in real life 4 years ago, and she's probably okay now. But there are little things that Ben or me would probably have done had he not been screwed over in the way he was by that school, or in other things. In a very similar way, years ago, a woman who had been interested in me, who had phoned me a lot, and anyway, I gave her some poems, and then she went crazy, and she got a what do you call it? Not a warrant.
Restraining order.
Restraining order on me, and I went to the judge. The judge thought it was ridiculous. This was 25 years ago, and yet then what happened was, a couple of years later, at my own poetry group, there was a guy who was actually harassing women, but I found that out later. And when I never confronted him, even though a couple of women had told me about this, because I gave him the benefit of the doubt, because I didn't get the benefit of the doubt. So in the same way, this Lauren girl, let's say if there had been something more sinister happening, Ben might have looked the other way. And I can even go back years ago too. I sometimes go back. There was this serial killer pedophile that I could have killed. And this is America for you in 2020. I could have killed. This is me, my Scorsese moment coming out, but I didn't. And I sometimes wonder if some of the little bad boys at the supermarket back in New York, where this all happened, that might have dissipated afterwards, to what degree I bear some responsibility for that. But then again, he had a corrupt cop brother who, when he was he could have been put away on insanity for being insane. The cop, the brother came with the thing from a shrink, and he was let go. But these are these kinds of little things that tie up in my own mind. And as a writer, things have consequences. So, fortunately, as far as I know, that Lauren girl didn't suffer any ill and whatnot, but she could have, because something else affects something else. The whole butterfly effect, garbage.
One thing I'll say there is, so like back to these characters. You said that Ben does change. It's not static. Another observation just came to me is how, so there's plenty of times in the book, right, where, Ben does not think much of like the teachers. He doesn't think much of, I don't want to say doesn't think much of the kids. Like, he's always like complaining about the work that the kids are asked to do, and also just the work that they end up doing. Like, if they're asked to be like, hey, like, can you imagine what you want to be like when you grow up? What do you want to be when you grow up? And it's like all these like inane answers. You would think that Ben is just this misanthrope that's sort of getting worse and worse. But in fact, whenever you see him confronting something that is like objectively bad in terms of like, ordinary human interaction, ordinary respect, like if there's a teacher that's making faces at a student, he would sit there and he would think like, wow, this is, so fucked up, and it's in some way abusive. But at the same time, like, that he is someone that on a kind of, I don't want to say deeper level, but in a more abstract level, doesn't really think much of people, right? And it sounds bad to say, because again, like that never really makes its way out personally, right? You don't see this kind of like vindictiveness come out. You don't see this kind of hostility ever really come out. And you have like actual stands that are taken that are, they're the things that people ought to do, right? When faced with these kinds of situations. I don't know how we got on this. We were talking about common sense or. Yeah,
and I was going to say one other way in which the common sense idea comes out, because then we took it down the art trajectory with the teachers and what they do or don't know and teach about art. But there's also a lot of moments highlighted of their corruption or blaming things on the custodians that they should be responsible for, and not speaking out when the custodians don't have the equipment they need, for example, but we've got $3,000 plasma screen TVs coming in so the football team can rewatch footage from their, shitty high school game in ultra HD 4K. And just the misallocation of resources. Whereas if, a teacher would understand the way that all these things are linking together, they would understand that the vested interest for more students and more, fellow people in the district would be to be a lot more intelligent with the way that things are requested and acted upon. And it's also, Dan, maybe you could comment on this, but like, if you're someone who knows American culture, you also understand that, like, of course, this is what's happening in Texas. Like, the football team is prioritized above any kind of actual learning because probably half the kids in that school district think they're going to be Tom Brady because, that's like an American mystique kind of thing, that we would rather try to have kids believe they could become a professional athlete than like a good worker in another industry or a good artist or whatever. So there's always appeals to like those kind of lower down the food chain ideals that Ben notices.
It's not just Texas, though. I could have written a very similar book about my 9 years working at the supermarket in New York. And there, the characters, like I mentioned, this pedophile serial killer, were even more over the top in a lot of ways. And people would have thought I was really making things up. This one, because it was only a year and a half, because it was in between two supermarket jobs that I ended up with the temp job right before this and being screwed over in that, it was just the perfect, and like I said, the little moments, the episodes just came so easily. It was just begging for me to do. Whereas if I was to try to do this, for example, with my 8 years at the supermarket in New York, I couldn't write it in that particular way. Even though there are a lot of characters like that, I've done a few plays with based on the New York supermarket I worked in years ago, and also too, this was 6 months after I left there. If I wrote about the supermarket in New York, that's 30 years almost of colorism. There comes a nostalgic feel that even I'm not totally immune to. There's no nostalgia really here. There is some sentiment. Ben does say he likes some of the custodians. He likes some of the teachers, some of the cute females, others, some of the males. But it doesn't reek of any mawkishness or when I was a young man, I remember kind of the feel.
Just one more observation before we move on. Like going back to the Zeke quote. The one way to think of this is the higher in education that you go. Let's assume that has an association with like the level of your salary. Like, the more that you have cushions around you, whether it's like pure money or people that are educated and have their own kind of like, larger social networks, that cushion just keeps you from cultivating common sense and exercising common sense. Like, I remember there's one incident in the book where Ben just like marvels at how like some teacher leaves out half open lemonade despite the fact that it says keep refrigerated after opening. And the fact is, like, if you're someone that does not value the whatever amount of dollars that cost, you're not even going to be curious enough to look at it to see if it spoils, right, or whether it can spoil. Like, you are you are cushioned from reality. And with education in general, like it is true, like the higher up that you go, you get so cushioned from reality, right? And you get so put into this bubble where, you know, people don't speak in the currency of common sense. People don't speak in the currency of even, you know, like truth in many ways, right? They speak in the currency of like in that world, right? In the world that is just hyper educated, you have a world essentially of where the currency is like these like sets of relations, you know what I mean? And because you have these excessive relations, you don't have to cultivate those other parts of you. And you know, this it's interesting because like, you know, a lot of these like janitors in the book, like they're not good people, they're not hard workers, they're not any of that for the most part, but they do have a quality that is sort of different from everybody else. And you do get the sense, though, that if Ben gets into these positions of power, you know, the common sense would still be there, and he wouldn't, you know, become like, you know, a stereotypical oppressor. Whereas like most of these like blue collar workers, you know, if you were to put them in charge of everything, like Deb Puss was just like, you know, she would go drunk with power, right? She would completely try to like use her position for, you know, even more like nefarious ends. Like now she's just sort of nickel and diming the school in all the little ways that she can. But, you know, you put somebody like that that's sort of motivated to do these kinds of things into another position, you know, they're not, you know, it's like the Nietzschean slave morality, right? Like they're just lusting to be in that position as opposed to having a consistent critique of, you know, those power relations. Anyway, that's kind of
I just want to read one section before we go. It's the beginning of the September 2016 section. And the thing with that teacher with the lemonade, by the way, is she was a really intelligent and nice woman. And the thing, she's also the teacher that I mentioned. She had her room trashed when she and her daughter went away for a month's trip to England or Europe, and she didn't find out about. And I remember the assistant principal there told me, you know, oh, we'll inform her about. There was just such a lack of communication as in anything there. But the thing is, these teachers kept letting these kids walk in and out of these. I remember kids walking out with boxes and stuff. Who the hell knows what they were stealing, books or typewriter ribbons? Who the hell else knows? And then the management would be like, well, why are we missing this or that? Well, I even in the book talk about writing down things that happened. Saw a kid in this room without supervision, and I'd have these lists along with the post-its of incidents I used. I'd have these lists, you know, 27 incidents that should have been. Yeah. But anyway, let me just read this one section. It's just emblematic of. It's an interesting incident, but it's also the way I write about it that's good. So, Deb Puss is scratching her bony old ass again as she sees me finishing sweeping up one of the rooms. She says, "Damn, you're really trying to make the rest of us look bad, huh? Take it the fuck easy, Ben. I just like to get going. The quicker I start, the quicker I'm done." "Fuck, I guess so," she says. "But you know that those fat fucks sit there in the cafeteria after they punch in till at least 4:30. I shrug my shoulders. "Except for Zeke. That fat bastard is there till 4:45 at least." I do not bother to ask Deb how the hell she would know all of this without herself often sitting there with the fats. So you get a sense of Ben's being more intelligent than her, but you also get a sense of how easily these people betray themselves and how, in a large sense, they're very much alike. They're all lazy. She's complaining about them sitting there brazenly, but how would she know if she was not there doing the exact same thing?
One of the things I wanted to mention that bull toad. I mean, it's a minor occurrence, right? You had this bull toad that's given a few different poetic moments in the text, and Joel said this is like, you know, this like creature that seems to be like the most enduring colleague of Ben's, right? He's sort of always there. He's consistent. He's more or less doing the same thing again and again. But, you know, I think the difference there is, you know, like in terms of comparing to the other characters, like there is something about like that toad's appearance where, you know, in a state of nature where I don't want to say, you know, the cosmos or like a state of nature is fair, because it's not, obviously, right? That's also not a meritocracy. But in that kind of state of nature where you haven't yet had, so many other corrupting influences that might make it into society, and so many like new power relations, like in the book, like you get a constant sense that the janitors and everybody else, like there is like a caste system, right? They do very much feel like untouchables. There is always a sense that, Ben is lusting after these teachers, but it's almost like he's kind of, he's like in a cage, right? And everything else is out there that, well, you can't have this. And why can't you? It's because we're in a different class. This book very much has a stronger feeling of class distinctions than I think like any kind of contemporary book that I remember reading. Like you see all the time, like the different ways that not only characters get treated, but the different ways that they feel, the kind of fears that they feel around like people of like so-called authority, even if it's meaningless. But to get back to the toad, in a state of nature, like this toad seems to like have, roughly speaking, some kind of merit. Like Ben walks by him. Even if he walks by too quickly, the toad doesn't escape, right? He's kind of, he's very content to be where he is. He's not afraid of the world in that sense. And then one time you see him with two, I don't know if there's a special word for female toads, but he sees two toads, right? So, maybe he's like having sex with both of them. And, you just get the sense that, in a pure kind of system where you don't have these other intrusions, maybe Ben would essentially be like, the toad. Maybe Ben would be the one that would be this polygamist, right? Maybe Ben would be the one that would have, things essentially given to him, right?
Bitches. I call it the bull.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, like, in the closest thing to, I guess, is kind of like state of nature where I guess like chiefs or whatever, like they're sort of exacerbating existing like power relations in the human mind. But, you could imagine like, in a world of like justice, you probably see more things like the toad, right? Being given essentially his due. As opposed to Ben, who, he's the most meritorious person in that building, but in some ways he's getting the least because, even if he's not necessarily the least paid or has the most health problems, like he does have to physically do more work because the more good work that you do, it is true. Like people want you to do more of it, right? And they want those other people to do less. Like I've been there, right? And, everybody that's been in a job knows that.
The best evidence of the caste system that you talked about, though, is that Ben is said to be 52 in the year and a half, and then 53, I guess, 51, 52. And then, yet, most of the teachers are younger than him. Most of the custodians are older than him. Yet the custodians are referred to by their first names, Ben or Deb or whatnot, whereas the teachers who are younger are called Mr. or Mrs. or Miss something or other. So there is that thing where it's the reverse. When I grew up, and most people even today are told that you give respect to the older. It should have been Mr. Christian, which was Ben's last name. But because of the politics and the whole way that system is structured, the younger teachers are elevated to the point where they get the honorific of Mr., Miss, or Mrs.
Yeah, exactly. Like even more with things like names, like you just get the sense that whenever the custodians are with one another, like there's always like a barrier. Like I felt like some level of low grade anxiety whenever Ben would like come across somebody that wasn't another janitor, because again, it very much felt like you are crossing a caste system. What kind of like fucked up thing is this teacher about to say now in this interaction? Or is she going to give him a strange look? Or, is she, there's always this kind of invisible, low grade anxiety barrier that's there. Right. And I don't remember reading many books recently that it gave that sense. And it just reminded me of, all the things we've been talking about politically over the last few years, how, there are caste systems. This is so invisible and nobody wants to talk about class, right? Like it's so much easier to talk about things like race because, it's very easy for corporations to, virtue signal about race. It's very easy for them to pretend like they're doing something about race while not, addressing class, right? That's the thing that's most damaging to power structures, right? It's to have like a class analysis of where the world is. I mean, maybe Joe, you could comment on that. Like, did you get the same feeling, like, as you read it, that as the custodians would interact with other characters, like maybe you would start cringing a little bit, like, oh God, like someone's going to give like a condescending look. They're going to say some condescending thing. And, I just don't want to see that again. Right.
Yeah, definitely. You're on edge. The more that you get to know some of the teaching staff after they each get introduced, you're more and more on edge as time goes by, that there's just going to be some really cringy moment that happens. And a few of them do. And so, on Ben's behalf, you're frustrated and concerned, about his treatment and what might befall him as he goes about. So I do remember that. And I don't know. There's also, if we're talking about like that low grade anxiety kind of feeling, there's also a sense that you get that from Ben, even though he's in the same caste or class as the other custodians, that at some point he may eventually break and lash out toward them, just because his intelligence level and his existence is, is more worthwhile than theirs from the standpoint of like what he's done and aiming to do with himself. But that never happens. And so it is one of those, like, it's a redeeming quality where, he'll be frustrated. He'll tell us as the reader some of his internal dialogue that's going on and what, maybe what he really thinks about these people and what might befall them or should befall them in a just society, the just outcome. But he still at the end of the day gives respect to everybody, and like attempts to see what could be good about them, and never reaches some kind of breaking point of condescension toward other people himself in that group, right? In the custodial group, I
think we should move on to just talk about the politics. The one thing though with that, there's a brief little incident that really happened, and Ben talks about his Dionne Warwick moment, just walk on by, when one of the gym teachers, Mr. Carter, he is in the room, it's dark, and he is, and it sounds like he's masturbating. And Ben sees through the slit that the guy is actually like pounding his head and like doing harm to himself. And he's walking. It's like, I'm not even gonna investigate this. He doesn't keep walking.
I don't want to know. Yeah.
One last thing before we get off the book. The climax in the book, correct me if I'm wrong. I was trying to reread this again to see if I missed anything, but just like there is no actual explosion from Ben, like, fuck you guys, I'm actually, so much greater than you are. I don't deserve this. You never get anything like that. You never get any characters truly changing their lives, like, despite, so many of them saying, like, I'm going to do this with my life. I'm going to do that. I'm going to, move on to some new job. I mean, Ben moves on, right? Most of the characters don't. But in terms of like climaxes, I think the closest thing to a climax is when I think it's Zeke, the one that gets fired. And you just get, like here was this guy who was this presence in the book, and suddenly he's just kind of gone. Right. And the book just structurally, it's a bit different, without him. The things that happen are a bit different without him, but more or less things go on. And the climax is almost anticlimactic in that sense, but it has like a very nice parallel with how, the book flows and what the book is and what the book is actually about.
Yeah, he actually got transferred. They didn't fire him because there was a hiring freeze because they couldn't get enough people.
Oh,
so.
Yeah. But there were some other people that got in trouble, and I think someone was being offered. Someone was offered, like, you could either get fired or get transferred. Yeah. So, do you agree that was the climax, or like, what would you say is the climax in a book? And how?
I don't think there is any climax because the very picaresque nature of the novel, episodic stuff, there really isn't a climax. It's just little beats, and this is what happened. To have made it, to try to structure it in any way that there's some climax or that there was some great moral, thou shalt not, whatever, would be antithetical to the very nature of what happened and how I wanted to write the book.
Yeah. But do you think that in all books, even in this book, there needs to be, if you don't want to call it climax, like is there something that you would call a fulcrum of some sort, a turning point of some sort?
It doesn't need to be. Most do have, and this is one, just artistically, this is one of the problems with most art, is that there's still the idea of a 3-act structure in plays. There's still Chekhov's gun, that if a gun appears in Act 1, it has to go off by Act 3, that the hero has to do this. This gets to the whole Joseph Campbell thing, which is really irrelevant. But Joseph Campbell, this idea that there's the hero's journey, and to get back to Vonnegut. Vonnegut had the best skewering ever of Joseph Campbell. He said, "Oh, that's the guy who spent a lifetime figuring out that the hero gets into trouble and out of trouble."
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I mean, as art, continues to grow, like one of the most important things to realize is number one, there is such a thing. If you don't want to use the word rules, fine. But at the very least, there are cues in art, right? There are directions and trajectories. There are side roads. If you're an artist that, focuses on being one of those like outlier types, that's fine too. But beyond the rules and the cues, you also get a slow, like, dismantling of the rules, right? Like, just like with any other phenomenon, something like religion, it's not so much that you need to, eliminate values and value systems. You just want to strip value systems until you remove everything that's unnecessary, right? Religion is a value system. It's better than many value systems, but it has costs, such as like it provides a costs to freedom. It has costs to, forcing you to believe things that just objectively are not true. But when you get down to it, you still all you're doing is you're stripping down. When you like get a new value system that's not religious, that's just purely secular, you're just stripping down the stuff that's unnecessary. So same thing with art, right? We're going to get more and more of this. Like we need to keep the fact that there are cues that must be in some way respected. But we're going to keep dismantling the rules until all that you're left with is the cues, right? And no inertia, right? A lot of these rules exist simply because they're like this kind of like inert mass, right? That it's there, it has the founders and the first mover advantage, but there's no logical requirement for the arts, right? For their continued existence.
And on that note, on to Trump.
Okay, so that's going to be the ArtiFact episode. So we're going to end here, and we will get to 2020. Hindsight is 2020.